Basically, as far as we should understand it, basically you have Sharia, but Sharia is interpreted differently through fiqh in different contexts in different countries. Like, for example, in Bosnia, there's different Sharia than it's in Indonesia, and then what's happening in Saudi is completely different as well. So, how would you maybe explain this, that every country kind of interprets the Sharia differently, I don't know. Have you studied this sort of process?
Yeah, so there's four canonical schools that we have nowadays of Islamic law in Sunni Islam,
Hmm.
and they call them the four madhabs or schools of thought. And madhahib is plural. And so you have the Hanafi madhab, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, and they all have their own histories and they're named after their founders and these types of things. The most populous, like the most followed by population or numerically by far, has always been the Hanafi madhab because it was typically the ones that Islamic governments used as their official school. So it's very widespread across the Muslim world and the most widely followed. Second most widely followed is the Maliki school, which started in Medina. It used to be the dominant school in Saudi Arabia before the Wahhabi movement, and it's dominant all across North and West Africa as well. And then the Shafi'i madhab, Imam Shafi'i eventually settled in Egypt. So Egypt, about 60% of them are Shafi'i, and the other ones follow different schools. But it's still kind of the main school, like at Azhar University, and the main one that is culturally commonly known amongst Egyptians. All of East Africa is Shafi'i because also a lot of the Sunnis that are in Yemen are Shafi'i, especially in Hadramaut. And the Hadrami people, they're very famous for being sea traders, and they would trade with everybody on the Indian Ocean. So they have communities that they in India where they would settle there, marry women there. And there's parts of India that is Shafi'i because of that. Indonesia converted to Islam and became Shafi'i through the Hadramis. And so usually around the Indian Ocean area, you'll see a lot of Shafi'ism. Um, and then after that is Hanbalism, which historically was always the smallest school. In the medieval period, it was even so small that in the medieval times, they talked about the three canonical schools. They didn't even recognize it really as a school so much. I mean, if you asked them about it, they would say, yes, it's a valid school, but it was so much not on their radar, not in their thought, because it was so small in number, they rarely encountered these people. But when we had the Wahhabi movement start in the 1800s in Saudi Arabia, it spread in Arabia, and now it's like a school that everyone knows about and talks about and deals with. And that's the one I originally studied when I converted to Islam. I now am a practicing Hanafi, but I still very much like both and study both. And so that's kind of in short the differences as far as kind of the abstract scholarly thought. But then you might even have the same school, like the Hanafi school, the one that's the most widespread. Different cultures will interpret it differently. And every culture has different issues that they're working with and different things that they're going to emphasize. So,
So maybe one question. So what do you think is the source of all these differences? If there's one Sharia, why are there so many schools, so many branches? Isn't it like somebody who maybe don't understand this, like, isn't there just one Quran? I mean, there's many hadiths and everything, but like, why are there so many schools of, thoughts on this?
so in every religious tradition, you have what's called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is a fancy word of saying like interpretation.
Hmm.
And so in a verse in Quran, it might be slightly ambiguous. And so scholars who were like experts in Arabic linguistics in the medieval period, they would debate as to what's going on grammatically in that verse of Quran. And so they'd say, well, if you understand the grammar this way, it changes the meaning completely.
Hmm.
So there'd be two competing ideas as to what the verse means grammatically. Sometimes they would also debate what the meaning of a certain word was. Does this
Yeah.
word mean fish specifically, meaning that it has scales and fins, or does it mean any type of sea creature? And they would debate that. So in the Hanafi school, they don't eat lobsters, they don't eat crabs or shrimp, because the Quran, they say, is talking about fish that is halal, not every sea creature. Where the other schools will say, no, that word to us means every sea creature. And so that is the first point, is you have linguistic differences.
Mm-hmm.
And then besides that, they have different epistemologies, which is kind of a fancy word for saying their worldview, or the way that they grade evidences, like which evidence is stronger than another piece of evidence, or what happens when you have things that contradict each other. So they have different methods of dealing with that as well. For instance, in the Hanafi madhab, with hadith, it has to be a strong, like a certain strength to use for fiqh. So a hadith, or a narration from the Prophet, during the early period, it has to have 3 completely separate chains of narration. And it has to be something that the people knew about and were doing. It was like a widely known
What
thing.
does it mean when you say 3 different sets of narration? Can you explain that?
So you have what's called a sanad, or a chain of narration, where it's like Muhammad said, and this is narrated from this guy, from this guy, from this guy, from this guy. And so you would check that to make sure those people actually met each other. You check to make sure those people were trustworthy, practicing, Muslims that were just and not doing crimes, or not liars or things like that. And so that would be one chain of narration. And so they would want 3 completely separate, so totally different people, but the same hadith, the same narration, it's the same teaching from
So
the
the
Prophet.
people would be unrelated, basically. They wouldn't had a chance to know each other. And the science behind these research of hadiths, it sounds pretty difficult, to be honest, like to look this up and to really verify all this data. Do you know how this is done, basically, just from a high level perspective?
Yeah, so there's like huge multi-volume books that are like biographical dictionaries. Like Bukhari has one, I think it's just called Tarikh al-Bukhari or something like that, where it's huge multi-volume work in Arabic, and it'll have a biography of all the different figures that they see in these hadith chains. And so a hadith scholar would go and look at that and could figure out the biography of when someone was born, when they died, if they're considered trustworthy or not, if they're considered a liar, if they did major crimes during their life, and those types of things. Because sometimes you might have a 7-year-old child who's narrating a hadith. And so was that child known for being highly intelligent and known for transmitting things without lying or making mistakes? Was his accuracy of transmission well known, and things like that? Or sometimes it might be the case that, yeah, this person was a young child. He wasn't known for being very accurate in his transmission, but he's talking about a horse, the Prophet's horse, peace be upon him, the horse stayed on his house. Like the horse lived on his property. He's seen it every day growing up as a kid. So probably he knows about it. So you kind of have that historical or biographical information to grade whether a hadith is actually sahih, like sound, or not. And so sometimes some people have, modern scholars like Sheikh Albani later in Saudi Arabia, he wanted to say some hadith in Sahih Bukhari were weak. And so some other scholars rebutted him and said, no, there's other historical factors that we that are looked at, such as this horse example that I just gave. Albani tried to say that was a weak hadith, and the other scholar says, no, that horse lived on this guy's house when he was a child, so he probably knows about it.
Yeah. And so you've mentioned different grades, like epistemology. So some societies viewed sources differently. So what do you know about any grading? Like, let's say, is hadith narration versus something that's in Quran, what's more important? Or
It's a very complicated thing, so I can only give you, like bits and pieces, and everything I say is kind of going to be oversimplified. But essentially, like in the Hanafi madhab, they will look at the hadith as being lower than the Quran. And if a hadith contradicts the Quran, like a Quranic verse, they will throw it out. They'll say it's invalid. It contradicts the Quran. How could we use it? Whereas in the Shafi'i madhab, they say if a hadith appears to contradict a verse of Quran, it's actually explaining that verse. It's further specifying what that verse means. So they prefer kind of to specify things further. The Hanafis prefer the general rule over specifying it. So instead of specifying, they're going to prefer the general, which is called am in Arabic. The specified they call khas.
Right. And in terms of tafsir, how is this different than fiqh then?
So tafsir in English, it's a very fancy sounding word. It's exegesis. And it's a Greek word, but basically it's an explanation of what the verses in Quran mean. And tafsir is a very big field. There's people who approach the Quran from many different perspectives. So you have tafasir, which is the plural. You have tafasir, which are about just Islamic law. So they'll look at the verses only from the perspective of Islamic law. So you have Tafsir al-Jassas, who is a famous Hanafi scholar, and he looks at the verses of Quran just from the Hanafi perspective. And you also have like a Tafsir al-Kabir, as it's known, from Fakhruddin al-Razi, and it just has everything in it. He's got mathematics in it, he's got philosophy in it, he's got Islamic theology, he's got Islamic law. It's just got everything. And it even might have some narrations from Christian or Jewish sources in it. They call it Israeliyat. And so it's a very, encyclopedic book. And I like that one. I like reading it quite a bit. You have other ones that just focus on, maybe theology, or some of them, like the new modern trend that scholars have been doing the past 100 years is called tafsir al-mawdu'i, which means thematic tafsir or thematic exegesis, where they just look at certain themes of the Quran, and they'll bring all the verses that talk about this one topic, this one subject, and then they'll go subject by subject by subject.